a group of students and a number of lecturers from the University of Abergay went to southern Colombia where these people were, and spent a lot of time just trying to understand their circumstances. So there was no discussion at all of design. It all centered on trying to understand where these people were, what their problems were, what has to be resolved, and above all else, to kind of win their trust. So the relation with those groups of people was the major initial investment. So that's a fundamental principle of autonomous design in relation to community. And then there was the beginning of the conversation of what to design. And the object of design was the thing that bonded those groups of people. So design became the catalyst. It became the thing that brought people together in cooperation, in difference. Now, this is another fundamental principle: commonality in difference. And that is the fundamental principle of community itself. So traditionally, certainly in the past, in religious societies, what bonded people was religion, was belief. In secular societies, there has to be something that substitutes that for people to believe in. And for these people, what they believed in was the necessity of a common future without conflict. So the conversation started. And they began with negotiating a cooperative agreement. So again, there was no discussion of design to begin with, or the design that was considered wasn't the design of anything other than the relationships between the people. Now, clearly, because it was a coffee growing region and because coffee farmers were involved, that became the center of the conversation in relation to design. So what could they design in relation to coffee other than the marketing of coffee? Well, the answer that emerged from the community was a message. So the coffee was used as a means of communication, both in terms of how it was presented in the marketplace and how it was marketed. So what was the message going to be? Well, obviously, one fundamental message had to be around the quality of the coffee, and the other was the quality of the community that produced the coffee. So the objective, the design objective, was to use the coffee to tell a story. So there was an enormous amount of conversation over several months about this story. Again, you can see very little designing in a conventional sense, because the story was designing what there was to be designed. And that story had to be able to be told on the packaging of the coffee and in the promotional material of the coffee. So this proceeded, and all the designers did was to kind of respond to the ideas of the community and to visualize them, to present them back to the community. The community commented, modified them. So it was a design dialogue. And that's another fundamental principle of autonomous design, design dialogue. In the end, the product was produced, was marketed, was kind of recognized as a very significant intervention, was seen to be successful by the government agency that was funding this exercise. The model that was created of the cooperation agreement became employed by other communities, and the principles became applied to other areas. For example, people who wanted to start a small custom specialized brewery making beer used exactly the same principles and were equally as successful. So the point about this is it works, but it works because you have to take things incredibly slowly, be extremely patient, and not prioritize the design outcome as the thing that's driving the exercise. So, in a sense, the importance of design arrives out of the process rather than through simply the design action. And what I mean by the process, the social process rather than the design process. Now, this model of autonomous design is explored and developed in much more detail than I've just outlined in the book by my friend Arturo Escobar. And the name of the book is Design for the Pluriverse. And if you haven't already got it, I highly recommend that you do. It's one of the most significant books on design that's been written in the last decade. So that's the first part. I said there was two ways of needing to understand autonomous design. The second wave is about the creation of the autonomous designer. And that is a designer who's an alternative, a critical alternative to the service designer. Now, the logic of most of the questions that you pose to me in the Q&A are really predicated upon the naturalization or the logic of design as a service. The autonomous designer doesn't function within that logic. And they don't function in that logic for a very specific reason, which is that in a service design relation, the most important design decisions are already made before the designer starts to design anything. They're designed by the client, the brief. It is the client who designates what is to be designed and for whom. And those are two really fundamental questions. That is not where the autonomous designer starts from at all. The autonomous designer starts by identifying a problem to be engaged by design. And that doesn't mean the solution necessarily of the problem. One of the problems that we have is that the assumption, and it's been part of design education for many decades, that design is a problem-solving activity. Design sometimes solves problems, but quite often it causes problems. And it causes problems because design is not initially recognized as a problem-defining activity. That is the thing that has to go in front of everything else. Because if you don't understand the problem thoroughly, if you don't recognize the nature of the problem appropriately, whatever you produce is likely to be a problem. And writ large, the scale of this problem is really evidenced by the nature of the world in which we now live. One of the concepts that I've worked on for many years is called defuturing, which are actions that take time away, which take the future away. So most of the problems that we have on the planet are problems in which design has been deeply implicated. If you just think about one of the most obvious ones, climate change, all the technologies that have created climate emissions have been a product of design, or the problems that kind of relate to urban environments are a result of design. So what designers have been incredibly good at is bringing things into existence. What they've been incredibly bad at is understanding the consequences of what they have created in time. And that fundamentally changes the ethical nature of design responsibility. Obviously, you can't foresee every possibility, but you cannot be kind of ethically responsible unless you attempt to really contemplate the consequences of what you create. So that's really at the core of why somebody would want to be an autonomous designer. They want to take responsibility for what they bring into existence by design. They want to identify the problems that they think that they can solve or engage by design. So it's a particular kind of entrepreneurship. And it recognizes some really significant relational implications of design. So this word I'd like to emphasize, and I hope you remember it, which is design is a relational practice. It is not a practice that ever just engages one thing. It is always engaging relational connections of causality, which are never linear, never in just one direction. So it is more complex than conventional ways of designing and conventional forms of design education recognize. So when you design in a relational condition, you're designing in the context of the political, the biological, the social, the technical, the anthropological, because design functions in all of these things. We live in a world within the world created by design. And the most significant thing to understand is that the world that we've created has an extremely problematic and unsustainable relation at the moment to the world that we fundamentally depend upon. So the absolute project, the project of autonomous design writ large, is to try to redress that imbalance, to try to kind of move the fulcrum, to move the balance from design being to become futuring rather than defuturing. Now, in this sense, the condition of design at the moment is in crisis. It's in crisis in two senses. It exists in a world that is in crisis, as a result of which, if it doesn't respond to that situation, it is part of the crisis. Therefore, it is itself in crisis. So how does this happen? How does somebody become an autonomous designer? Well, first of all, it cannot happen quickly. It takes time. It requires experience. It requires the application of new knowledge. And again, one of the absolute principles is increasing the level of education of designers. Really, if you don't understand the world that you're in, if you don't have the ability to be analytically competent in relation to that world, you're not really in a position to make sound design decisions. So whether it is a question of changing the nature of design education, or whether it's simply the designer taking more responsibility for their own education, because of the situation that we are now in, design has become increasingly important. The challenges are increasingly larger, and the necessity for the designer to be better educated are driven by that situation. So, as I've said, it takes time. You have to gain experience. You have to kind of invest in your education. You have to have a process of the development of capability. And how do you do that? You do that through the adoption of speculative projects. You start to create a portfolio of speculative projects. And one of the principles with that can be summed up quite simply. If you identify a problem and you fully understand that problem in the way that I talked about earlier on, and you can address that problem in a positive way that either solves it or allows a situation to adapt to deal with that problem, you have a very good chance of somebody financially supporting you to do that. So the first thing to begin is to begin to kind of acquire the ability to create a speculative portfolio, a portfolio of projects that you've chosen for yourself that engage to something that needs to be engaged. The next thing is to try to acquire the ability to pitch that to somebody who is likely to support that. And what that requires is the development of your rhetorical skills. And the only way to do it is to do it. So you have to create the situations where you're presenting your ideas on a regular basis, getting feedback and developing that skill. That allows you to be in a position to acquire sponsors, to get grants, to get supporters, to be able to take an idea to the market, to find investors, all of those things. So that's, in a sense, inflecting the commercial dimension of design in another way. Now, another area which I've spent quite a bit of time really working on in relation to this is called second order design fictions. I've just written a book on design fictions, and the design problem that that book addresses is relocating a city as a result of sea level rises. Now, you can imagine that's an incredibly difficult project with an enormous number of design implications. So second order design fictions is applying some principles from second order cybernetics. And the principle it implies is around the observation of observation. I won't go into the technical complexity of that, but what it means when brought to design fictions is that you create a story that attempts to imagine the complexity of the problem. And you could create characters and sub-stories that try to deal with that, understanding that problem. And then that becomes something that is subject to a critical review. And out of that critical review, you look at the things that were missed. You look at the good ideas and the bad ideas. And what you are doing is you're putting yourself in a position to write a complex brief for a complex problem. So that's a different model of design fiction for the familiar one that exists at the moment, which is often used to create a conversation around prototypes or scenarios. You know, this is a different kind of design fiction. And it's really linked back to what I was talking about in terms of the acquisition of experience. So in order to be able to do this, you have to choose things that you know something about. So how come I could write a story, which was a 35,000 word story about moving a city? Well, that's because in 2008, I worked on moving a city in northern Sweden with 40 other designers are selected around the world to work on that project. I worked on 2 award-winning design competitions that had a relation to moving a city. I've written 2 books that relate to design and climate change. So I used all of that knowledge to write the story. So the acquisition of experience doesn't necessarily translate to being able to immediately identify how you're going to use that experience. And you can't necessarily know what is the most appropriate experience to gain. What you do know is you have to do a variety of things. You have to lead an interesting life if you're going to be able to design interesting and significant things. You have to acquire intellectual capital and acquire cultural capital. So where I went from there is to design another design fiction, which is now being edited, which is a very different kind of project, which is to produce a book, not with a kind of theoretical support, nor producing a brief, but just to create a picture of an idea that has the potential to be realized. So the book is about moving 200,000 Rohingya refugees from Bangladesh to eastern Malaysia to begin the reforestation that is necessary for the destruction of the forests of Borneo, which is where eastern Malaysia is. So going back to what I was talking about in terms of pitching an idea and trying to do things that creates a project. I've written this book, 85,000 words, and I'm going to give it away to all the NGOs and all the United Nations organizations involved in dealing with the problem of Rohingya refugees. I don't know whether anything will come of that. It is a speculative pitch that potentially could have a significant consequence. So that represents maybe about 9 months' work. Okay, so to sum up, what do you have to do to become an autonomous designer? You have to be able to take a risk. You have to be prepared to take a risk. You need to have faith in yourself and you need to have courage. You need to acquire experience. You need to be able to think about what you're going to do in a much longer time frame than perhaps you're familiar with. You need to recast your ambition. You need to think in terms of planning and plotting your life as a designer over a period of about 10 years. You need to get out in the world. You need to actually put yourself in the context of problems. You need to educate yourself. You need to read. And in order to survive, you have to lead a double life. You have to often get a conventional job with a non-conventional ambition that you're working towards. Now, what I'm aware of is that I don't know exactly how many people I'm talking to at the moment, but I know that most of you are not going to do what I've just suggested. But I do know that there's a chance that a few of you will. And the bottom line, the punchline, the last thing to say is that a few really competent and motivated designers can make a huge amount of difference. And the negative of that is that the whole phenomenon of global mass consumption was started by less than 15 designers in the United States in the late 1920s and the 1930s, creating the whole streamline aesthetic, which created a transformation of desire for aestheticized products, which now is something that permeates the entire world of hyperconsumption. So that's where I finish.
Thank you so much. It was very thought-provoking. Yes, so the plan is that we could now ask the questions in relation to what we heard now from Mr. Fry. And yeah, so I will give the floor to the participants. Please do come up with questions or comments, reflections. Maybe then I could start. I'm not a specialist in design, rather working in art history and theory and methodology. However, maybe this will be a naive question, but I would like to ask, what is the difference between the social design and the autonomous design? Because I hear that there is this kind of social turn, which is of course also evident in other disciplines of aesthetics, in terms of being more directed towards the needs of the community. This is what you mentioned as this quality, and in terms of participatory and participatory approaches that would then grant a bigger agency to those who most likely do not have the voice or ability to stand for themselves. Yeah, so that is my question.
Okay, so what you just said is the key to the answer, which is saying that people do not have the ability to stand for themselves. Autonomous design doesn't accept that proposition. It believes that every community has the ability to actually address and overcome its problems. So the fundamental difference is that social design is designed often for the community rather than by the community. So obviously the one can migrate to the other. You know, in other words, social design can turn into autonomous design if the people doing it are sufficiently sensitive and perceptive.
Thank you so much. Yes, any other questions? So let's see what we have in chat. Yeah, the questions that you have submitted, they will be discussed in the Q&A part. But now we could ask questions that are related to particularly the presentation that we just heard. Yeah, so that is the plan, that after this we will have a break and then we will have the Q&A with already the provided questions.
So let me ask you a question. Anybody can answer this question. I mean, what is difficult for me to gauge, because I haven't had your experience. I don't know anything about your courses. I don't know anything about you. So what I don't know is whether what I've said resonates, whether it connects, whether it seems relevant to you, whether it seems strange, whether it's familiar. So what is your reaction to what you've heard?
Yes, thank you. anybody from the faculty. Of course, I could answer on behalf of myself, but we have also design specialists like Lena Jakobsson, maybe addressing you.
Good morning. Thanks, Mr. Fry, for a wonderful lecture. Regarding myself, yes, I'm quite familiar with what you were talking about. I've read both your text and also those by your colleagues, and as well as the book of Escobar and so on. So the research I'm doing involves all that kind of issues. So I personally am, and I'm also trying to transmit some of this information to my students if the content of the courses is if it's relevant from the content for the courses. But of course, I consider that it becomes more and more relevant for any kind of design course, basically, because it's not that you need to have a course in autonomous design in order to talk about those issues. You actually, as you told, the design education should be more integrated. All kinds of knowledge should be integrated into one objective, basically, sustainability. This is what it comes to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, for example, if you've got a 4-year design course, you know, the equivalent of 2 years should be just education. It actually doesn't take very long to acquire some basic design capability, and the reality is, when you get a job, you mostly learn on the job anyway. And to be frank, a lot of design education now, you know, is redundant or will become redundant, because if I just compare my education with the situation now, almost everything I was taught is now completely redundant, because the industry has changed, the technology has changed, the economy has changed, the position of the designer has changed. So there's a way in which education generally is out of step with the crisis of unsustainability. You know, we are still designing on the principle of business as usual.
And that is actually also promoted by most of the design education that we judge and evaluate in terms of how many of the students get positions in companies, or how many of them start their own businesses as designers, and that is all really commercially oriented and judged in terms of how much money does it make. And how it sells.
So I think the appropriate way to think about it is to understand design as an education that allows you to do many things other than just design things. You know, design in some respects is a way of learning. You know, you can't predict necessarily what design work you're going to get. And when you get a design job, you have to actually invest in understanding that. And if you're going to be successful, you have to understand it well. So you actually have to embark on a process of learning. So every design job is also a learning exercise. And again, having the ability to do that is something that the luxury of time in education allows you to cultivate. And, you know, the other observation is dominantly it's done badly. For every good designer, there are hundreds or thousands of really mediocre designers.
Yeah, so what you are saying actually resonates with me as well in terms of knowledge production, because what I hear is that there should be some kind of a dialogue between different kinds and fields of knowledge. So it should really be somehow facilitating this kind of transdisciplinary approach when work not only within the disciplines, but also beyond and across them.
Yeah.
Definitely, yes, I do agree with you.
So you know, one of the problems is, again, that the idea of design that people arrive with is massively disconnected to what we are now talking about, the reality that design has to be able to embrace. So there is a way in which the initial part of design education is always confronting the misunderstanding of the nature of design. And you know, many students never let go of that misunderstanding.
But there's also a misunderstanding in the society in general, and this is what we often encounter as design professionals, that when we want to set up those collaborations with other professionals, they do not really understand what our role should be, and they do not take us seriously enough, and they think, especially because we often come from art schools, and again, you know, what's the impression about people in art schools? They are definitely not the most serious people and the most intelligent people. That's the assumption, right? And that, of course, also is not helping, let's say.
Yeah.
I mean, have you encountered also similar attitudes, or have you heard it also from other students elsewhere in the world?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, what you're saying is absolutely true, and the media, you know, is heavily implicated in that, in the way that it represents design and reduces it just to style and aesthetics. So that misunderstanding doesn't happen by accident. It is actually constructed, and it is also constructed in schools. You know, schools give students a very inaccurate understanding of design. Any students going to say anything?
Yes, please, some of the students.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. My name is Eva. I'm like studying functional design in art academy in for master's degree. And for me, like everything that you said, of course, I had like some new ideas. What should I make my work and like forward? What should I do better to become like better designer in order to help people have better life? And my focus on what I'm like trying to work is with people with mental disabilities, and to try to find a way how they can have more independent life here in Latvia. So I'm having like I take my notes. I took my notes, and like, maybe it will be better in my work forward. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an important thing to be working on. I mean, and I'll give you a slightly different perspective on it, in that we live in a world that is unsettling. You know, for many people, it literally unsettles them. They become refugees. But anybody who's living in an environment where crisis is a part of everyday life is unsettled. So it's a psychological condition. And because of the problems that we have as they're accumulating, both environmentally and geopolitically, unsettlement is going to become an increasing phenomenon of the psychology of contemporary life. So in a sense, the distinction between mental health and mental illness is becoming more and more blurred. So it's worth just thinking about that condition of unsettlement, and it is also recognizing that quite a few mental conditions that are designated as sickness are also being able to be thought about in a different way as coping mechanisms of how you try to find a way of surviving in a world in which you don't think you're able to survive.
Thank you. Yes, anybody else from the students would like to comment or ask a question?
Me. Hi, Tony.
Yeah.
I'm
Hi.
Helena. I'm a student from Art Academy of Latvia. I'm also Eva's classmate, and I study functional design in a master. I'm not gonna have a question, but just a thoughts as reflection, as you said. In bachelor's, I graduated packaging design, and actually I graduated it in the pandemic, when actually pandemic started. And actually after that, I took it in a whole different level, that actually packaging in these days, I'm talking about these days, it's like a, let's say, like a protective layer. And it's not only just design or how beautifully it looks in the store, but it's just in these days it's more important to make it as a protective layer. But at the same time, I have seen plenty of environmentally harmful packaging solutions. And at the same time, as you mentioned, that design is a problem defining, right? Problem solving activity. But that at the same time, in these days also, there's a plenty of solutions that cause more problems than before. And as also you said, students should invest in our education. I totally agree with that. But at the same time, those designers or people, let's say that, are actually with the who made those solutions, horrible, harmful solutions, are usually with the education, right? So I have no idea how can we get out of this horrible situation in these days. Just my reflection. Thank you so much.
Well, there's no, obviously, I haven't got an answer like that, have I? I mean, it's incredibly difficult. But I will just say one thing, that language is incredibly important. We can start to change the language of design. So just to give you one example, we need to cross out the word product. There is no such thing, in a sense, as a product, because everything is process. Everything that we bring into existence goes on having a consequence. So the idea of a product being an endpoint, of a point of termination, a point of completion, is an inaccurate representation of its condition. So once you start seeing things as process rather than product, you start to be able to think about them in another way. And that isn't a very difficult thing, to get somebody to understand. So in a way, you could start to begin to review the language of design education. What would another language of design education look like?
Thank you. Yes, that's a very valuable piece of advice. And thank you, Helena, for raising this question. Yes, anybody else?
Yes, hello. I'm sorry, I don't have my camera. My name is Laura. I'm from the University of Latvia, and I study graphic design. And of course, what you said probably applies very differently to different areas of design. But I guess my reflection would be that even though I've just recently started studying, I'm in my second year, I have come to the conclusion that maybe the way that I have viewed design is very shallow. Maybe I haven't been giving much thought to the meaning of the projects I've been doing and the design I've been making, because I've been too concerned with aesthetics, with style. And I feel that that's very much applies to the people around me as well, that we always talk about the almost the prettiness, the shallowness of the designs we're making, and not the actual use, the actual meaning, the impact it can make on people. I guess that's my reflection. Thank you.
Okay, so let me just reflect on your reflection. one of the most significant things that we face is a visual design problem. And this is because we have a whole series of very serious global circumstances that actually don't arrive in their kind of relational complexity. The way in which knowledge is divided separates these things out. So they don't actually, the situation doesn't get represented. So we live not just in an environmental crisis, we live in a crisis of representation. And the crisis of representation is the absence of what needs to be represented. So there's a crisis of crisis in terms of visual design.
Thank you. Yes, anybody else? Thank you.
Yeah, no, just to reflect further on the same issue, I think that with regards pretty much the graphic designers, I think that this visual side of the things, this graphics is something visual, however, it doesn't need to be underestimated. It also can be a medium, a means for achieving something, for raising awareness, for transmitting certain messages and so on. I think that the example that Tony gave us about Colombian coffee, and so it also involved graphic design, certainly. So I think that in that sense, in every discipline of design, we have to employ our media that we have and our instruments and tools that we have in order to do the same thing. So
yeah, I mean, I think that the thing is that design is enormously important, but that importance is not actually being recognized at the moment. It doesn't arrive in design education. I mean, you could say that, you know, the generation of designers that are being created now will emerge over the next decade are possibly the most important designers there's ever been.
Okay, any other questions, reflections, speculations?
Yes, hello. My name is Gita, and I'm from Rezekne Academy of Technologies. And what you said, Tony, was very important for me, actually, because I've been thinking about these things lately, that being a designer and this like job of design, it's a very great responsibility. And I think we should always think about the consequences, what we make, what impact will it leave on Earth, on planet, and we should think in a far distance, not just some years or so, because yes, about this climate crisis and this garbage crisis and all these things, and so yes, it's very, very important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you know, trying to think more significantly in a longer span of time is difficult, but it's something that we really, really need to try to do.
Thank you. Yes, anybody else? Yeah, so everybody's still pondering and thinking over all these very complex and complicated issues. So I guess we could probably have a 10-minute break and then return back to the screens at 11:10, and then continue with the Q&A.
All right.
Thank you.
Fine. Okay. I have to learn. Yeah, so design isn't something that you have to learn to do. It is something that you can refine as a capability, but it is already there, ready to be developed.
Okay, thank you. Then there were some questions that concerned the matter, the issue of talent. Is it important and can we measure it, or is it rather subjective?
Well, it's not, I don't think it's either. I mean, talent, in a sense, expresses itself in whatever form it takes, in whatever medium it exists within. And it isn't something that you're even necessarily aware that you have. I mean, it only becomes aware when it is affirmed from elsewhere. And it doesn't have a specific form. I mean, there isn't this thing that has an independent existence that we can say is talent. So there isn't a kind of an answer to that, really.
Yes, thank you. Another question is how to become a hero designer who thinks and designs for the future, solves the problems without creating new ones, and therefore making an actual difference in the world.
Yeah. Well, I kind of react against the notion of becoming a hero, really. So I would simply substitute that by saying, how do you become a good and responsible designer doing useful things? And that is a matter of diligence, application, and the willingness to make sacrifices and to take risks. There's a story, this is a little digression, it won't take me too long. There's a really famous book by Sun Tzu called The Art of War, and it's been used well beyond just the application of war. But the story starts with defining the activity of 3 doctors. So the first doctor isn't particularly good, but he's very famous and spends a lot of time investing in his, what we would now call, profile. The second doctor is a bit of a better doctor, but it doesn't have the same appearance, doesn't have the same identity, doesn't have the same profile. The third doctor is almost completely unknown, but he's an absolutely fantastic doctor. So we have those 3 choices. And every one of us, in a sense, whether we know it or not, makes a decision of which of those 3 choices that we're going to become in relation to design.
Thank you. Okay, another question. Have you personally had a moment in your career when you realized, yes, I am knowledgeable in design now and I have reached the peak in terms of knowledge of professional achievements?
No, I still feel ignorant.
It's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
Yes, another question, how to achieve originality and the competitive advantage in design?
Well, depends what you mean by competitive advantage. I mean, I don't have personally any kind of economic competitive inclination, so I can't tell you how to achieve that. And the measure of success for me is what you bring into existence does, the agency of what you create.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, another question. Is there a difference between an artist and a designer? What is it?
Okay, well, neither of those things are reductively or singular. So what it means to be a designer is a graduated and differential activity, as it is in relation to an artist. So the categories are not fixed and reductive. They are fluid and transformative, and some overlap obviously exists. So in a sense, the binary doesn't really exist.
Thank you. Another question, how a designer can influence society's values? I think you partly already answered it, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, you don't ever constitute that as an objective. You don't set out to try to transform society's values. And you know, what is society in that sense? It's kind of amorphous. Again, it comes back to attempting to do something which is responsible and useful in the circumstances that we're in. You know, that's the ambition. If society's values change as a consequence of that in a positive way, well, great, but you don't set out with the objective of transforming society's values.
And why particularly wouldn't you, if that's necessary? For example, in like, for example, now in a situation of the climate crisis, and you know, a lot of the problem is in how we perceive the climate crisis in general. Lots of people do not agree that there is any crisis at all. So it's a question of values, I think, in a certain sense. Is this a bad point of trying to influence that also?
No, what I would say is that what you set out to do is to change people's perceptions rather than their values. I mean, again, these two things, you know, are indivisible. But I don't think that you kind of reify values as the thing that you give a priority. I mean, ontologically, what counts is what people actually do. What their values are, in a sense, is secondary. People don't necessarily act on the basis of their values. People act in relation to the imperative of their circumstances. So, I mean, using a very simple design illustration, there are now many designers who have a value in relation to design which is quite contrary to what they actually do when they are actually paid to design. So I go back to what I said. I think that what you're actually trying to do is to change what people do rather than what people think. And obviously perception does have a relation to that.
Well, I mean, in that sense, people normally do not aim at doing bad things. They normally, I guess, most of the people are rather idealistic, especially about themselves, and they consider themselves doing the right thing. So what makes them think what is the right thing? That is the issue, how to...
Yeah, well, that might be true of some people, but I mean, a lot of people, I think, cynically are motivated by simply their self-interest. I mean, if you take, for example, politics, most people are voting for themselves.
Okay. All right. So shall we move on now to the second statement, which was put in a very brief way: design is in crisis. And here we have several comments and answers, and they are defined as rather reflections and not so much questions. So the first statement as a response to design is in crisis is the following: design is in crisis because the visual identity of new brands is very similar in terms of millennial aesthetics, choice of simplified fonts, pastel colors, etc.
That's nothing to do with design being in crisis. I mean, it might be a crisis for somebody from some organizations, but design is in crisis because it is failing to engage the condition of crisis, which is the existential condition of our species. No, I mean, my response to these questions, I mean, the same as the response to the last question, is these are conversations, these are discussions that don't actually reduce to there being a nice trite answer that you can kind of wheel out that solves the problem. They are things to talk about, to think about. And you know, in that conversation, you know, you have to be open to kind of continually modify what you're saying, but from a kind of a principled position. Understanding design in crisis is indivisible from understanding the world in which we exist being in crisis. And that is something that needs to be brought to the notice of everybody, including designers. I mean, we don't actually recognize the crisis, to go back to what I was saying earlier on, because the crisis is not adequately made present for us. And that is a challenge for design.
Yes, we also have some comments reflecting on this particular aspect of crisis. So yeah, there is one comment which says, design is in crisis because designers deliver design products to respond to the needs of consumerist society. For example, colorful plastic is used for packaging. After the product is consumed, the packaging is thrown in waste and thus contributes to the overall pollution. The task and responsibility of a designer is thus to change the consumer behavior and patterns through offering ecologically less harmful options.
Okay, so pragmatically, you know, that's true, but more fundamentally, the very notion of consumption, if you remember what I said about words, about language, using the example of product, well, consumption is the same. We don't actually consume what it is that we are told that we're consuming. So, you know, you buy a refrigerator, it lasts 10 years. What have you got? You got a refrigerator. You haven't consumed it. The only things that we consume are those things that we ingest. So the problem of consumption is the lack of consumption. We don't consume. In terms of the conversation around a circular economy, the circular economy should be predicated upon the maximization of consumption in a fundamental sense and an appropriate way of dealing with what is not consumed. So as soon as you start kind of describing the things in a different way, then you have the ability to think about them in a different way. So I put, again, consumption on the list as something to think about. Now, if you actually look at another use of the word consumption, consumption was the kind of vernacular way of talking about the disease of tuberculosis. So what is tuberculosis? Tuberculosis is a disease that consumes the body that it inhabits. It eats away at the body. So in fact, that definition of consumption is more appropriate to think about than the economic definition, which is a kind of a misdescription of the process that it is attached to.
And what terms would you suggest to use instead then to describe this buying of stuff?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good question, and it really invites kind of thinking about, and there isn't, kind of a ready to hand word that you can inject, but I think that the kind of way to deal with it is to kind of understand that equally production and consumption, that binary relation, needs to be kind of renamed. So in a way, the kind of the circular economy is trying to do that. So, something like circular materiality, and in a certain respect, again, a discourse which has attempted to do some of this is the kind of the whole discourse around new materialism, because the implication of what we're now talking about is that we need to think about materiality in another kind of way, and that's again a big project that is underway but is not making a massive impact. Don't you agree?
No, I just was thinking about the thing that, as you said before, that the language matters and the words matter. And then it, of course, is true. And also languages are different. And for example, in English language, if you talk about consumption, and indeed it implies something as digestive process or something like that.
Yeah.
And again, in Latvian language, for example, etymologically, it means spending. It comes from spending, basically. So it is kind of more related to what we do when we buy stuff.
Okay. Well, in that case, but I mean, in that case, kind of, there's a nice link across to expenditure. So I think that creates quite an interesting kind of play of words and play of thinking.
Yeah, because this is something that I've read also in other scientific literature, that the language that we use, the fact that the mainstream scientific language has become English, for example, also implies a lot of things. We understand things in a certain manner because we use this particular language.
Yeah.
The knowledge that is created in this language may differ from knowledge that is created in some other language. And in that sense, of course, we don't have this we're in a situation of being able to talk about how we perceive world, because nobody understands our language except for a couple of million
people.
I mean,
well, every language is also a cosmology. So every language has its own world. And the one thinker that, in a sense, comes to mind who has given attention to this is Georges Bataille and his notion of general economy. Which is, recast in contemporary circumstances in terms of the necessity of expenditure and the relation of excess to expenditure. So, yeah, it's a fruitful area to kind of engage. But coming back to the original question, the original question, the thinking of that question is kind of challenged by the nature of the problem.
Can I have like a comment? Of course, my native language is not English, and I can understand this term in front of view of my Latvian language, and it like in our language it means like to this consume. It's like to eat up something, as you mentioned. But in this example of refrigerator, it's not like. But I'm seeing that like to produce this refrigerator or whatever else, we kind of consume up the resources of the nature and power and something like that. So it's not the same thing that we consume, and the resource and the nature is kind of like everything is. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, Martin Heidegger calls that the standing reserve. So we use what we were talking about in relation to consumption in terms of the standing reserve. Consumption becomes destruction. So, in a sense, what's happening, the nature of unsustainability, is our lack of consumption and the renewal of what is being consumed is actually destroying the very foundation of the conditions in which the most fundamental things are produced. In other words, the things that actually sustain us as beings.
Thank you so much. Now we could go back to the comments in terms of design is in crisis. And there is one more comment in terms related to technologies, and it goes like this: design is in crisis because the AI solutions and opportunities provide cheap and fast design products. The human factor is undermined.
Yeah, technology. I'm going to deflect it insofar as understanding design or understanding technology is a particular kind of designing, okay? And its consequences are far more serious than just its relation to consumption. Because what's happening with technology as an ontological designing is changing a very significant quantum of our species, and is creating a situation that we're moving toward futurally, where we're going to have a percentage of the human population in a number of decades' time who are going to be, in a sense, transhuman, who are going to be a synthesis between technology and biology. But at the same time, in the opposite direction, the number of people that we will be abandoned will also increase. So effectively, we're in the beginning of a process of the fragmentation of our species, and technology is deeply implicated in that process.
And what direction is the solution then, in your opinion?
No, yeah, I mean, I'm going to sound boring again because it comes back to the making of present. I mean, we do things, and what is happening, especially in technology, is the people that are creating things are doing so without any understanding of the consequences of what they're creating. And that is what needs to be made present. I mean, just take a very simple example. When the internet was created, there wasn't the faintest idea of what the consequences of the internet would actually be, and we still don't understand that. What the future is going to be as a result of the kind of technologies that are now in place, is incredibly difficult to have any sense of. But so the question doesn't get asked. I mean, if you go back and look at it, just with an example from 100 years or so ago, if you just think about the objective of the invention of the motor car was just to get a carriage to go along the road without a horse. So that becomes realized. But then if you think about what cars have actually designed in the world, in terms of the transformation of transport, cities, the way in which people move around their countries, the nature of the industries that they arrive in their production, the kind of services that are associated with them, the kind of the economic consequences of the car industry, the kind of medical consequences of car accidents, and so on. It goes on and on. Well, we're in exactly the same situation when somebody brings something like Facebook into existence. There's no idea about where it's actually going to take us.
Okay, thank you. Another comment, design is in an ethical crisis, which reveals a contradiction between the designer's mission to create new and better things and the global situation with overproduction, when we should think of massive adaptive reusing, recycling, and preserving the existing. Design is also in humanity and personal face-to-face experience crisis because of the pandemic restrictions and overall computerization of many processes, including design education.
Yeah, there's a whole bundle of things there.
It was, yes.
Yeah. So I'll just go back because it's kind of the shortest summary of the problem to what I've already just been saying. Design is in crisis because it doesn't know how to take responsibility for what it brings into existence ethically. That's one definition of crisis in relation specifically to the ethical issue. I mean, what do you have a course in design ethics in any of your colleges that is more than just the way in which ethics is dealt with as a professional practice issue? I mean, do you have a whole course around the ethics of design?
Yes, that's a question, I guess. Liana?
Yeah.
Yeah, Andra, do you have?
Not literally named like that, but of course we continuously talk about ethical issues during when we develop the tasks together with students and so on. Yeah. Definitely.
I mean, I think it's worth it.
Yeah, but as you said, and as also some of the questions have shown, and as the students themselves acknowledge, that we do not think that globally as we probably should. We still tend to think within the paradigm that we have right now, within the given status quo, basically. Within this consumer producer relationships and designer as the one serving the producer and kind of serving the consumer, and everything is, you know, human centered and so on and so on, but in the end it is not good for the human race, so it's not human centered.
So I think the value and the potential of a course in design ethics is it brings all that stuff into question.
Can I comment on this? We had a design ethics course, but it was like in a scope where we touched the relationship of designer with a client, like in business, but not like a designer's relationship with the environment, like ethics. In this scope, we didn't like add this.
Yeah, I mean, that's the normal way design ethics have been taught in many design courses around the world. As I said a moment ago, just linking it to professional practice, which, you know, is a very kind of limited and myopic way of thinking about ethics.
Yes, maybe I can add, because I'm also teaching in business school. So the new generation of the new entrepreneurs, and what they are focusing on is something related to design ethics, but obviously more in entrepreneurship context, which is corporate social responsibility. But very often, of course, it is about ethics. But from the point of view of entrepreneurs and having this responsibility for the society, including the environment, because the environment will affect the future societies.
Yeah. I mean, that was, you know, a few years ago, all that kind of triple bottom line stuff had a lot of profile, but it seems to have slipped off the agenda.
But if I may ask you a question regarding what you were talking during the lecture and also repeatedly right now, about the fact that when we introduce something new by design, especially technologies, well, we are not aware of what is it going to bring in the future. And okay, I understand the first thing is the most important thing maybe is becoming aware of this fact that we don't know and that we should take it into consideration way broadly that we are doing right now. But what would be the next steps then? If you acknowledge that we are not capable of actually estimating what is going to happen, how should we proceed then?
Okay, so there's obviously there is not a possibility of having a completely accurate picture of consequences. But the act of consideration, in a sense, is a kind of an inhibition. In a sense, it has the potential to create a condition of caution that doesn't exist at the moment. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get it right, but it is a positive development if that concern exists as a conscious reflex to any activity that you're contemplating in relation to bringing something into existence. But then it also is a question of reflection upon what actually does occur. So there's a kind of a historical dimension of this that, in a sense, gets brought back to the process of consideration and modifies it. So on the one hand, there is the estimate of consequences that you make, and then there is the actual history of what it is that comes into existence. And these two things can obviously be brought into a critical relation to each other that kind of reforms or informs that kind of reflective and projective initial activity. So really what I'm saying boils down to the initiation of a process of learning. So that there isn't a predictable outcome, but there is an improvable process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, it partly says, if I understand correctly, that this becoming aware is already the huge step in the right direction, and that in the end,
yeah, I mean,
we're not sure, but what counts is the intention, at least.
Yeah, because once you become aware, concern arrives. And then with concern, there is a potential of caution, and then there is a potential of an improvement of judgment. So that's really what I'm talking about.
Okay. Yes, Lena?
I don't know, I'm stealing all the trouble here.
Yes.
Wants to ask something.
No, it's fine. I mean, look, I want to make it two things clear. First of all, there aren't any easy answer to any of these questions, and that's obvious. And secondly, that I'm aware of the students who are silent, and I'm aware that a lot of what is said in relation to the concreteness of some of these questions, is sounding to some people rather abstract, but in fact, it's the very reverse. It's actually trying to get to expose, as it were, the concrete issue at the basis of the kind of questions that are being asked. And in reality, to deal with these questions is a much longer conversation and process. So I think people need to take the questions that they've asked away and actually work on them themselves after this conversation. Don't just put them to one side. They are questions that really go back to the very basis of what it is that you're deciding that you want to do. They go back to what it means to be a designer and what it means to bring into existence of things by design, because you're bringing the world in which we exist into existence by design. We live in a design world dominantly.
And how do you stand against in general the product design as a discipline, because it's still being the industrial design or product design, which is still being taught in most of the universities across the world.
Yeah.
What should become of this discipline? How should we continue doing this?
Process design.
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
but still.
well, I mean, okay. One take on the answer is we need to kind of get rid of the disciplinary model that exists in relation. I mean, the most capable designers historically have not been the designers of just particular things. They are the kind of a developed design ontology allows you to design many different things. So as soon as you decide to be a product designer, you're actually putting yourself in a condition of a restrictive practice. So that is one thing that we need to kind of work on, to break down the divisions of knowledge of design and to elevate the significance of design at the same time. And then the disjuncture between what is designed on the one hand and what needs to be designed on the other, again, is something that demands to be made present. And a lot of the most important things to design are both immaterial and equally another really significant dimension is how we learn to be able to eliminate that which needs to be eliminated by design. So there's in a sense, there's an entirely new design activity to be able to develop, because there are masses of things that need to be designed away. So yeah. I mean, so you could start writing projects where the task of the student is to get rid of something by design,
or identify a problem. Could also be
Mm-hmm.
the name, instead of trying to solve them, which is not yet really acknowledged in the education as a kind of a, let's say if you have a graduation work, then you are expected to deliver something, not just saying that there is something wrong, right? So
yeah. But it comes back to why I talk about the autonomous designer, because in order to do many of these things, you obviously have to find a way of delinking from simply being a service provider to the status quo.
Hey.
Okay.
Yes, it sounds like a wrap up to me. I'm not sure about the others. Yes, in terms of attention span and the wealth of information that now we can process and put in practice. Yes, if there are any other comments or questions, you can still use the opportunity and ask or express concern. Yes.
I've got I've got one last thing to say, but
Yes.
I'll wait until see if there's anybody else who wants to say anything first.
Maybe to conclude, because I was reflecting on what you last said, and I totally agree. And in the Art Academy where I work, at the master's level, we already have eliminated the disciplines, and we are actually working more on processes rather than products or material things. And but in bachelor's, it's still the old school. And
Yeah.
I was wondering, is there maybe a program that you could suggest us to look at or to study maybe in detail, a study program, I mean, the curriculum, which on the bachelor's level, which somehow complies with what you're saying, with your ideal, let's say, how the education should be structured. Is there something already in place?
Well, I'll illustrate it with a story of failure, okay? Because I created a bachelor's and a master's degree in design futures. And the university that was employing me destroyed it. And they destroyed it because the level that was required of entry to be able to do it was working against the acquisition of the number of enrollments that their business model was based on. So the basis of that the basis of that undergraduate program, in a sense, was my book on design futuring, and turning that into essentially a syllabus. Okay, so can I just say the last thing then?
Sure.
So I want to kind of connect everything I've been saying to the university and education in general, because what we have is a geriatric institution at the end of the Enlightenment that is not really fit for purpose for the world in which we exist. So we've got this massive contradiction. There are more universities than there have ever been before. There are more students than there have ever been before. But the actual nature of the university is fundamentally failing to produce the knowledge that we need to be able to create the world which gives us a chance of sustaining ourselves over an extended period of time. So one of the things that I'm trying to work on is the conversation really about the future of the university. And if you look at the history in the past, because there was an ancient university, medieval university, then the modern university in the late 16th, early 17th century. What changed them in each case was the appropriation of new knowledge from various sources. Another story which I'm not going to try to tell now. So I think the critical thing is people contributing to the production of the knowledge that is necessary to address the situation that we're in. And the project that I'm associated with is called the URMADIC, URMADIC, is an organization called, and it's a new organization, which is just theurmadic.org. And it's producing a zine, which is on that website called Urmadica. It's just one example of people internationally coming together to try to think about how to create this new knowledge. And I'm just kind of recommending or suggesting that, you know, in Latvia, in that part of the world, it would be productive if you could find a small group of people to take that challenge seriously.
Thank you so much. Lena, yes, you wanted to add something.
No, I was just wondering if Tony could put the address, the internet address in the chat. Look at it. I didn't catch the name.
The name is Urmadic, URMADIC.
U
R
R
MAD
M A D
IC.
Uh-huh. Yeah, Medic University. Yeah. I got
Yes.
it. Thanks.
All right.
Yes,
So well,
we are
thank you
finishing on a sad and dystopian note, but there is a ray of
No, we're starting with an appropriate recognition of the reality of our situation.
yes, and that's the very first step
Yeah.
that is crucial, indeed.
Okay, so thank you for your interest.
And thank
Good
you for the lecture and the conversation. It was a very, very groundbreaking in terms of that we need to rethink our strategies in both in design, but also in education, in knowledge production. So
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye-bye then.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.